In 1924, deep within the Appalachian valleys of Tennessee, Abigail Collins vanished. Her disappearance wasn't just a mystery. It was a void that swallowed an entire community, leaving behind only dread. No one saw her go. No one heard a scream. Only an unsettling stillness remained, a chilling echo of what those ancient peaks can conceal. Her terrifying case is etched into that very quiet. There is a kind of silence that only exists in the mountains. It's not the silence of cities at dawn, when traffic stops and buildings fall asleep. It's another kind, older, denser. The kind of silence that seems to have a memory. Anyone who has walked through the valleys of Tennessee knows what we're talking about. That stillness that envelops everything like a second skin, where even the wind seems to carefully choose the moment to blow. It is in this silence that this story begins. And it is in this same silence that it, in a way, still lives. The year was 1924. The world was trying to recover from the scars that the Great War had left on almost every family in the country. In the big cities, people danced, drank in secret because of prohibition, and tried to forget what had been lost. But in the mountainous regions of Tennessee, especially in the Appalachian territories, life followed a completely different rhythm. There, time did not obey the city calendar. It obeyed the seasons, the harvests, the behavior of animals before a storm. The communities scattered throughout the valleys and slopes of the Appalachian Mountains at that time were small, closed, and profoundly self-sufficient. Families knew each other for generations. Neighbors knew the names of each other's offspring, knew when someone's cow had fallen ill, knew when a family was going through hard times. It was that kind of place where everything seemed visible, where it was almost impossible to keep secrets. And perhaps that's why what happened to Abigail Collins had such a profound impact. Because in that kind of community, where everyone watched each other, where everything was recorded by collective memory, she simply disappeared. And nobody, absolutely nobody, knew how. Abigail Collins was 32 years old in the spring of 1924. She was the daughter of a farmer from Sevier County, a region that today borders the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, but which, at that time, was merely an expanse of mountains covered in dense forests, where the trails were known almost exclusively to the locals. She had grown up there. She knew those woods like the inside of her own house. Every bend in the creek, every protruding rock by the roadside, every tree that served as a landmark when the fog descended and covered everything. Those who knew her described Abigail as a woman of calm temperament, but with a kind of quiet determination that was impressive. She wasn't the type to talk much, but when she did, people listened. She had been widowed 2 years earlier, when her husband, a man named Thomas Collins, died during one of the winter storms that sweep through those mountains with a violence that those who haven't experienced it can't quite imagine. Since then, she had managed the small family property almost entirely on her own, with the occasional help of neighbors who stopped by to check on her. On the morning of April 23, 1924, a Thursday. Abigail left home shortly after dawn. It was a common occurrence. She usually walked along the nearby trails early in the morning, before the day's heat made the air too heavy. The neighbors saw her leave. No one thought it was strange. No one imagined that this would be the last time anyone would see her alive, or even see her at all. As evening approached, and Abigail had not returned, the first signs of concern began to emerge. As the sun set behind the peaks and the dense darkness of the mountains enveloped the valley, concern turned to alarm. The neighbors gathered. Lanterns were lit. Names were called out from the hillside. The echo responded, "Not Abigail Collins." What the inhabitants of County Sevier found in the following days, and what they didn't find, is what makes this story something that even today, more than 100 years later, resists any simple explanation. Because mountains hold secrets in a very specific way. They don't hide things. They simply envelop them in that ancient silence. That silence that holds memory, and let time do the rest. We will enter this silence together, step by step, valley by valley, and perhaps in the end, you will understand why the name Abigail Collins is still pronounced with a kind of special care by those who grew up in that region of Tennessee, as if saying the name aloud could awaken something that preferred to remain quiet. Stay with us. This story is just beginning. The search began on the night of April 23rd, but it was the following day that it took on a scale rarely seen in Sevier County. Men from neighboring properties arrived before dawn, some bringing sniffer dogs, others carrying tools that could be useful if Abigail were injured, somewhere inaccessible on the hillside. Dowd coordinated the groups with the seriousness of someone who knew that every hour lost in the mountains could mean the difference between finding someone alive or finding nothing. The terrain was vast and treacherous. County Sevier at that time was covered in such dense vegetation that sunlight rarely touched the forest floor in certain areas. The trails Abigail used to walk were known to the locals, but even for those who knew them well, walking there after a rain, and it had rained the night before, was a task that demanded constant attention. The ground became unstable. In places that had seemed solid, the streams overflowed and changed course with disconcerting speed. The moss-covered rocks became silent traps. The groups searched the main trails first, then the secondary paths, then the stretches where there wasn't even a path, only dense forest and the constant sound of water running invisibly beneath the rocks. They called her name. They stopped. They listened. The silence responded with a depth that those who have never been to the Appalachian Mountains cannot quite grasp. It wasn't the absence of sound. It was the presence of something that didn't use words. On the second day of the search, one of the groups found something that made Harlan Dowd pause for a long moment before speaking. At the edge of a trail leading toward a hill known locally as Crow's Summit, a name the elders of the regions said originated from something that had happened there many decades before, though no one knew exactly what. There were tracks that appeared to belong to Abigail. The shape of the footwear matched. The direction led east, up the slope toward an area where the vegetation became even denser. The group followed the tracks for almost half a mile, and then they simply stopped. There was no sign of a fall, no disturbance in the surrounding ground, no indication that anything had happened at that specific point. The tracks led to that point and went nowhere else. As if Abigail Collins had walked to that exact spot and simply ceased to exist in the physical world. Harlan Dowd was a practical man. He had spent over 20 years dealing with the harsh realities of a region where life was difficult and deaths didn't always have convenient explanations. He wasn't given to speculation or the kind of thinking that easily slipped into the supernatural. But years later, according to accounts from people who knew him, he admitted in private conversations that that spot on the Raven Summit Trail had been the only place in his entire career where he genuinely didn't know what to think. The search continued for another 8 days. 8 days of men scouring every inch of forest humanly possible. 8 days of tracking dogs losing the trail, always in the same general spot, as if something in the composition of that area simply erased any olfactory signal. 8 days of women waiting in the valleys, with hot food and hopes that were becoming progressively quieter. On the 10th day, the search was officially suspended. Not because anyone had given up on Abigail, but simply because there was nowhere else reasonable to search. What remained was not a body. It was not an explanation. What remained was an absence with the exact shape of a person. That kind of emptiness that small communities feel in a very specific way. Because where everyone knows each other, the absence of someone has a face, has a voice, has the habit of appearing on a certain corner at a certain time in the morning. Abigail's neighbors continued to visit her property for weeks afterward. Someone looked after the animals. Someone maintained the fence. It was the way those communities had of saying they hadn't yet accepted the loss, of acting as if the homeowner might appear at any moment down the path, slightly late, with that calm and determined expression that people remembered so fondly. But Abigail didn't return. And as the weeks turned into months, and the months stretched into the autumn of 1924, something else began to happen in County Sevier. Something more subtle than the disappearance itself, but in a way equally disturbing. People began to talk, not openly. That wasn't the way of those communities. But in hushed conversations, in comments dropped between sentences, in pauses that lasted a second longer than necessary when Abigail's name was mentioned. What these conversations contained was a kind of collective memory that until then had been kept in the most secluded corners of the community, memories of other things that had happened in that region, of other people who over the previous decades had entered the most secluded parts of the forest and returned different or not returned at all, of animals found in states that made no sense to the known predators of the region, of sounds heard at night that the older residents recognized without being able to name them. None of this was new. It was old, very old. And the disappearance of Abigail Collins had acted as a kind of key that opened a door the community had kept closed for a long time, not out of forgetfulness, but by choice. Because some doors, once opened, are very difficult to close again. And it was precisely that door that a group of researchers from the University of Tennessee in Knoxville decided to push even further open 3 years after Abigail's disappearance. What they found and what happened to some of them during that expedition added another layer to a story that already had too many layers for any simple answer to encompass. But that's what comes next. In 1927, the University of Tennessee in Knoxville was one of the few academic centers in the South that demonstrated a genuine interest in the isolated communities of the Appalachians. This was not a common interest at the time. Most American academic institutions of that period were focused on large cities, on growing industrialization, and on the social phenomena emerging from expanding urban centers. The Appalachians were generally seen as a marginal region, beautiful in its ruggedness, but too far from the spotlight to merit systematic attention. There was, however, a small group of researchers who thought differently, led by a man named Edmund Ferris, a professor of anthropology with a career built on the study of rural communities in the Deep South. This group believed that the mountainous regions of the Appalachians held within them records of a rapidly disappearing America, customs, stories, forms of social organization that no longer existed anywhere else in the country, and that if someone didn't document it soon, it would disappear forever along with the generations that still carried it in their memory. Edmund Ferris was 51 years old when he organized the expedition to Sevier County. He was a methodical man of firm convictions who had spent decades developing an almost instinctive ability to gain the trust of closed communities, the kind of skill that isn't learned in a classroom, but built visit by visit, conversation by conversation, respect by respect. He had previously worked in isolated communities in Mississippi, Alabama, and the most remote parts of Virginia. He knew that the key to any research in that kind of environment was patience. To arrive without haste, to listen more than to ask, to let people decide how much they wanted to share. What had drawn Ferris's attention to Sevier County specifically wasn't just the disappearance of Abigail Collins, though that case was certainly part of the context. It was something broader. During his preliminary research, he had found scattered references to a series of unexplained occurrences in that region, spanning at least 6 decades prior to Abigail's disappearance. People who had vanished in the same dense wooded areas. Animals found in conditions that older residents described with a caution that Ferris had learned to recognize as a sign that something was there that went beyond what words could convey. He arrived in Sevier County in March of 1927, accompanied by 3 other researchers, 2 younger men named Robert Ashby and George Pell, both in their 20s and still at the beginning of their academic careers, and a woman named Clara Voss, a specialist in regional folklore who had published 2 works on the oral traditions of the mountain communities of the Appalachians of Northern Carolina. It was a small group by choice. Ferris had learned that large groups disrupted the natural dynamics of the communities he wanted to study. 4 people could move with a discretion that 20 could never achieve. The first few days were dedicated exclusively to making contact with the local residents. Ferris knew that arriving and asking questions about disappearances would be the quickest way to close all doors. Instead, the group presented themselves broadly, researchers interested in the history and traditions of the region, people who came to learn, not to teach. This approach worked as it always did in Ferris's hands. Gradually, the residents began to relax. Some families invited them to sit at the table. Some of the older residents began to speak, and what the elders had to say was dense. Not in the dramatic sense that an outsider might imagine. There were no grand revelations, no confessions or stories told with enthusiasm. It was the opposite. It was a quiet, almost resigned density. The kind that happens when people talk about things they've learned to live with, without ever having been able to explain them. A lady named Eunice Barrow, who must have been about 75 years old and had been born and lived her whole life on an estate less than 2 miles from Raven Summit, told Clara Voss, in an afternoon of slow conversation on the veranda of her house, something that Clara wrote down word for word, and that Edmund Ferris read several times in the following days. Eunice said that the forest in that part of County Sevier was unlike any other, that there was a difference that anyone raised there learned to sense from an early age, even if they couldn't accurately describe it, that the animals living near that area behaved in a way that animals in other parts of the forest didn't, not aggressively, but in a way she described as aware, as if they knew something, as if they were waiting for something, and that the older residents, those who had grown up there even before Eunice was born, had always said that that specific part of the hillside was a place where the world became thinner. Ferris held on to that expression for a long time. The world seemed thinner. It wasn't the kind of language he expected from a practical Tennessee lady, accustomed to the hard life of the mountains, with no inclination for the dramatic. It was an expression that came from somewhere deeper, from an observation accumulated by generations of people who lived close enough to that place to notice what occasional visitors would never notice. In the following days, other residents said variations of the same thing, not with the same words, but with the same core, that there was something in that area of the hillside that didn't behave like the rest. That animals disappeared there with a frequency that couldn't be explained solely by the region's natural predators. That people who ventured into that specific part of the forest returned, when they returned, with an expression that acquaintances described as difficult to name, as if they had seen something they didn't have the vocabulary to process. Robert Ashby, the youngest of the researchers, suggested they visit Raven Summit. The suggestion was inevitable. It was the focal point of everything they'd been hearing, the place where Abigail Collins's tracks had simply ceased 3 years earlier. Ferris agreed, but set conditions. They would go during the day, in broad daylight. They wouldn't separate at any point. They would take enough equipment to spend a night away if something delayed them, but there was no intention of spending the night in the area. The hike to Raven Summit took about 2 hours from the last inhabited property. The trail began like any other trail in those mountains, familiar, marked by decades of use with that well-known feel that ancient forests have when frequented by generations. But as the group progressed and the vegetation became denser, something began to change in a way that all four felt, although none of them spoke about it at the time. Silence was the first sign. Not the gradual silence that naturally occurs as you enter a denser forest. It was a more abrupt change, as if there were an invisible boundary beyond which sounds simply decided to cease to exist. The birds that had accompanied the hike with a constant presence up to a certain point simply stopped. The wind, which had blown with some regularity in the more open parts of the slope, disappeared completely. What remained was that silence with memory that only exists in very old places, and which this time seemed to have become even heavier than any of them had experienced before. George Pell later said, in conversations with colleagues in Knoxville, that, at that specific moment, he felt something he described as the physical conviction of being watched, not a vague impression, a bodily certainty, the kind that makes the back of your neck tingle, and your eyes instinctively scan your surroundings without your conscious mind having ordered it. He looked at the others and saw in their faces that he was not alone in that feeling. Edmund Ferris kept walking. He was the kind of man who trusted discipline more than feelings. But his notes from that day, pages handwritten that same night when the group had returned to the safety of the valley, reveal that even he had felt something he couldn't categorize within the vocabulary that a lifetime of academic work had given him. And what they found when they reached the point where Abigail Collins's tracks had stopped 3 years earlier was something he would need much more time to try to understand. The exact spot where Abigail Collins's tracks had ceased 3 years earlier was marked by nothing that a casual observer could identify as special. There were no out-of-place stones, no trees with unusual markings, no obvious terrain configuration that would explain why that specific point had become the center of everything. It was, at first glance, just another stretch of forest, dense, damp, covered by the permanent shadow of canopy that closed so high above that the sky was reduced to irregular fragments of light between the branches. Edmund Ferris stood there for a long moment before doing anything. It was a habit of his to let the place speak before asking it questions. Clara Voss walked slowly around the perimeter, observing the ground attentively. Robert Ashby stood near the entrance to the clearing, with that expression of someone processing something they haven't yet managed to articulate in clear thought. George Pell, who had documented most of the expedition through detailed notes, opened his notebook, but remained silent for a while, which, to those who knew him, was a sign that something had interrupted his usual process of transforming observations into words. What they found in that stretch of land was nothing that could be photographed or put in a labeled box. It was a quality of the place that resisted conventional documentation. Clara Voss, who had spent years studying how rural communities describe their relationships with the surrounding landscape, later said that this was the kind of space that people raised in those mountains had learned to recognize in a way that goes far beyond what the academic language can accommodate, a space where the boundary between what can be explained and what cannot seems porous in a very specific way. Ferris began taking notes. He described the vegetation, the soil composition, the direction in which the trees grew. There was something slightly irregular in the way the larger trunks bent their upper branches, all of them veering away from the center of the clearing, as if an invisible pressure emanated from that specific point. It was subtle enough to go unnoticed at a casual glance. But when you stopped and observed carefully, the consistency of the pattern was hard to ignore. All the trees, all bent outward, as if the center of that space was something the vegetation itself preferred to keep its distance from. Robert Ashby was the first to mention the ground. There was an area, approximately 3 meters in diameter, in the center of the clearing, where the soil had a slightly different coloration from the surroundings, darker, not from the damp darkness that comes from shade and normal organic decomposition, but in another way that Ferris, kneeling down to examine more closely, described in his notes as a darkness that seemed to come from below, not from above, as if the soil at that specific point had absorbed something over a long period of time, something that had left a permanent mark on the very composition of the earth. Clara Voss asked Ferris if he wanted her to collect soil samples for later analysis. He said yes. But as she approached the center of the dark area with the small container she carried for this type of collection, something happened that all 4 witnessed, and that none of them could satisfactorily explain afterward. The dogs that had accompanied the group, 2 animals borrowed from a local resident, experienced on trails, and absolutely not given to erratic behavior, stopped simultaneously, refused to advance a single further step toward the center of the clearing, and began to emit a low, continuous sound that none of the researchers had heard before. It wasn't barking. It wasn't howling. It was something in between. A sound that seemed to come not from the animals' throats, but from somewhere deeper, as if their own instinct was trying to communicate through a frequency that the humans around them were only partially equipped to receive. Ferris watched the dogs for a long moment. Then he looked at Clara. Then he looked at the center of the clearing, and he made a decision that he himself acknowledged in the pages he wrote that night as being guided by something different from the academic methodology that had defined his entire career. He said they wouldn't go any further that day, that they would record what they had observed, collect what could be collected from the periphery of the area, and return to the valley before the light began to change. No one questioned the decision, and that in itself said something. Because Robert Ashby was exactly the kind of young researcher who, under any other circumstances, would have argued for further investigation. The fact that he said nothing, that he simply nodded in agreement and began to gather his belongings, revealed that what the place had communicated had reached him as well, through whatever channel that kind of communication uses when words are unavailable. The descent back into the valley was largely done in silence. Not the uncomfortable silence of people who have had an argument or who harbor resentment. It was a processing silence, the kind that happens when the mind is working on something bigger than it can quickly resolve. And the body understands that the best it can do is not to interfere. The dogs walked close to the researcher's legs the entire time, without the detours and side explorations that had characterized the ascent, like animals that had decided for their own reasons that keeping the formation closed was the most sensible thing to do. That night, gathered at the home of one of the local residents who had offered lodging to the group, Ferris asked each of the researchers to independently write down what they had observed in the clearing, without discussing it amongst themselves before putting it on paper, to avoid the memories of some contaminating those of others. It was a procedure he used in the field when he wanted to record collective experiences in a way that preserved the individuality of each perspective. When the 4 accounts were compared the following morning, there were differences in the details, as there always are when different people observe the same space. But there was also an overlap at the core that Ferris found significant enough to underline several times in his notes. All 4 had recorded the feeling that the silence in that place had a quality unlike any silence they had experienced before. All 4 had mentioned the inclination of the trees independently of each other, and all 4, including Ferris, who had written the most restrained and analytical account of the 4, had at some point in their description used the idea that the place seemed to be waiting for something, not in a threatening way, not in a welcoming way, simply waiting, with the specific patience of things that have existed for much longer than anyone who might pass by. Over the next 3 days, the group returned to talking with the residents, now with more targeted questions. Ferris wanted to understand the history of that place, not the story of Abigail Collins specifically, but the longer history, the one that stretched for decades, and perhaps even longer. And it was in these conversations that a figure began to emerge from the community's memories, with a consistency that Ferris had not anticipated. It was the figure of a woman, not Abigail Collins, someone much older, someone whose name the older residents knew but pronounced with that particular care that communities reserve for things they don't want to invoke carelessly. A figure who, according to the fragmented accounts that Ferris and his team pieced together conversation by conversation, had lived on those slopes long before any of the current residents or their families. A figure that some of the elders described not as someone who had died, but as a presence that had remained rooted in that place, in the same way that ancient trees take root with a depth that goes far beyond what the surface reveals. Ferris spent an entire night reorganizing his notes around this figure, trying to construct a timeline from fragments that, by nature, resisted linearity. And the more he reorganized, the clearer it became that there was a connection, not probable, not confirmed, but possible in a chilling way, between this ancient presence and the disappearance of Abigail Collins 3 years earlier. A connection that didn't fit into any of the categories his academic training had given him to work with. And the closer he tried to apply the analytical lens, the more it seemed to recede to a distance where analysis simply couldn't reach. The figure that emerged from the community's memories had no fixed name. It was as if, over the decades, the different generations that had inherited the knowledge about her had also inherited the caution of not fixing that knowledge in something as concrete as a name. The elders of Sevier County referred to her in different ways, sometimes as the one who stayed, sometimes as the old one on the hillside, and at times only with a vague gesture towards the mountains, as if the words themselves were unnecessary for those who already knew what she was. Edmund Ferris was a man who had dedicated his life to studying the collective memories of rural communities, and he had learned throughout his career that when a community develops multiple ways of referring to something without ever settling on any one of them, it usually means one of two things. Either the knowledge about that thing was so old that the original versions had been lost, and what remained were fragments of fragments, or there was a deliberate choice to keep that knowledge fluid, not to allow it to solidify into something that could be easily grasped, transmitted, or more importantly, used by people who did not understand the weight of what they were handling. Clara Voss was the one who managed to have the longest and most detailed conversation about the figure. It wasn't planned that way. It happened during a visit she made alone, with Ferris's permission, to the home of a woman named Dessa Mabry, who lived on a small property in the upper part of one of the secondary valleys of County Sevier, a considerable distance from the more central properties of the community. Dessa was between 80 and 90 years old. She herself wasn't sure, because she had been born at a time when birth records in that region were irregular at best. She was a woman of diminutive physical presence, but with a quality of attention that Clara later described as disconcerting, the kind of gaze that makes you feel you're being read in layers you didn't even know you had. The conversation began indirectly, as all truly important conversations in those communities did. Dessa spoke about the weather, about the harvest, about a storm that had felled an ancient tree near her property the previous winter. Clara listened attentively without haste, without straying to the topics she truly wanted to explore. And then, in a moment not signaled by any obvious change in tone or pace of conversation, Dessa simply began to talk about the hillside. She said there was something in those mountains that was older than anyone who had ever lived there, older than the families who had considered that land theirs for generations, older, probably, than any human memory that region held. She didn't describe it as supernatural, and Clara noted this carefully because it was precisely the kind of distinction that separated a folk tale from something that came from a different place. Dessa wasn't telling a ghost story. He was describing a geographical reality in the same quiet, factual way he might describe the depth of a stream or the slope of a hillside. According to Dessa, the presence in that specific part of the forest had been recognized by the peoples who inhabited those mountains long before any European colonization reached the region. She knew this not from studying history, but because she had heard it from her own grandmother, who had heard it from a previous generation in a chain of oral transmission that extended over a time that Dessa did not attempt to quantify. What this chain conveyed was the idea that this place had always been recognized as different, not necessarily dangerous, but different. A place where the normal rules of the world were less rigid, where the boundary between what is and what was and what could have been became porous in a way that did not happen anywhere else in those mountains. Clara asked carefully what had happened over time to people who had entered that area. Dessa was silent for a moment. Not the silence of someone hesitating to speak, but the silence of someone organizing something that exists in their memory in a non-linear way and needs a moment to find the right entry point. Then she said that throughout her life and the lives she had inherited, through the stories passed down to her, there were always people who disappeared in that area, not with alarming frequency, not in a way that could be easily separated from disappearances that happen in any large forest for completely understandable reasons, but with a consistency that when you piece together the cases over the decades formed a pattern that was difficult to attribute to mere chance. And there was something else. She said that some of these people would return. Not all of them. Most didn't, but some did. And those who did return were different, not in a way that could be detected immediately. Sometimes it took days, sometimes weeks, but those who knew them well understood. There was something in their eyes, she said, a quality of distance, as if a part of them had stayed there, and what had returned was the greater part, but not the whole. As if the place had exacted a kind of toll that wasn't physical, but was real in the same way that anything physical is real. Clara listened to all of this, and then asked about Abigail Collins. It was a risk. It could shut down the conversation, but Dessa didn't. She stared out the window for a moment, at the mountains visible in the distance, and then said something that Clara transcribed word for word, and that Edmund Ferris read several times in the following weeks. Dessa said that Abigail hadn't in the way people thought, that disappearing suggested something passive. Someone who had been taken away, someone who had been lost, and that what had happened to Abigail was different. That Abigail had gone with the same quiet determination, that everyone who knew her recognized in her that there was something in that place that she had felt, and that she had chosen to approach, in the same way that one approaches anything that seems to call to you. in a way that doesn't use words. Ferris held on to this interpretation for a long time. There was a huge difference between a woman who disappeared and a woman who went. The first was a victim of something. The second was an agent of her own story. Someone who had made a choice, even if that choice was toward something that no one around her could see or understand. It was a distinction that fundamentally changed the nature of what had happened, if it was true. And it raised an even more disturbing question than any that the simple narrative of the disappearance had raised until then. If Abigail had chosen to go, what was it about that place that had drawn her strongly enough that a practical, grounded woman who knew those mountains better than most would simply answer the call and not return? What kind of thing exerts that kind of attraction? And the question Ferris wrote in the center of a blank page, and then stared at for a long time before moving on to the next. If there was something there that drew people in, and if some of those people returned changed, what exactly returned with them? In the following days, the expedition underwent a shift in tone that all members felt, but that no one explicitly articulated. The work continued: conversations, note-taking, field observations. But there was a different quality in the air of the group, a growing awareness that what they were investigating had begun to cross the boundaries of what any academic framework they had brought from Knoxville could accommodate. Ferris was accustomed to this kind of intellectual discomfort. He had spent his entire life inhabiting the fringes of what can be systematically understood. But even for him, there was something in that particular case that resisted in a way different from the other resistances he had encountered throughout his career. It was in this context that Robert Ashby proposed something that everyone else, under normal circumstances, would have immediately rejected. He wanted to spend a night in the area near Raven Summit, not inside the clearing. He was careful to make this distinction. Nearby, at a point from where the clearing could be observed from afar, but which was outside that invisible perimeter that everyone had sensed during the previous visit. He argued that there were patterns that only revealed themselves at night: animal behaviors, sounds, qualities of light that the presence of the sun completely obscured, and that without at least one nighttime observation, the expedition's work would be fundamentally incomplete. Ferris remained silent for a long time after Ashby finished speaking. Clara looked at George Pell. Pell looked at his notes. Neither of them said anything, and it was this collective silence, not of agreement, not of disagreement, but something more like a surrender to the inevitability of what the story was demanding, that Ferris interpreted as a sufficient answer. They would go, with all possible precautions. But they would go, because there were questions that only the darkness of those mountains could answer, and because in some way that none of them could rationally explain, all four felt that Abigail Collins' story hadn't ended just because she had disappeared, that there was something still open there, something that was waiting with that specific patience of very old things to finally be seen. The night the group chose for the observation at Raven's Summit arrived with a clarity that contrasted almost ironically with the weight of what they were preparing to do. The sky over Sevier County was clear in a way that rarely happened in that region at that time of year. The stars visible with a sharpness that made the celestial vault seem closer than it should be, as if the entire atmosphere had decided to become transparent on that particular night. The moon was in its first quarter, enough to cast a diffuse light on the more open slopes, but which became completely useless within the dense canopy of the forest where they were going. Edmund Ferris had established clear rules before they set off. No one would separate from the group under any circumstances. No one would approach the central clearing. They would position themselves at a high point, at a distance that Ferris had estimated was sufficient to observe, without entering what he called, in his notes, the zone of influence of the place, using terminology he recognized as scientifically inadequate, but which was the most honest he could produce to describe what he had felt during the daytime visit. Each would carry lanterns with enough oil for the entire night, and a condition that Ferris added almost as an afterthought, but which the others immediately understood as probably the most important. If any of them felt a strong and inexplicable urge to move toward the clearing, they would verbalize it immediately instead of acting on their own. This last rule revealed something about Ferris's mental state at that moment. For a man of his background and temperament, establishing a rule based on the possibility that group members might be compelled by irrational impulses represented a significant concession, an implicit admission that the place they were about to observe operated according to logics that intellectual discipline alone was not enough to neutralize. None of the other group members commented on this. It wasn't necessary. The walk to the observation point took longer at night than it had during the day, not because the path was different, but because each step was taken with greater deliberation. Each shadow was processed before being dismissed as harmless. Each sound was listened to until the end before the group continued onward. The dogs that had accompanied them on the first visit were not brought this time. The resident who had lent them had declined politely, but with a firmness that left no room for insistence when Farish mentioned the possibility of a night visit to the area. He had said only that his animals would not go there at night, and that if the researchers had any sense, they wouldn't go either. They went anyway. The observation point that Farish had chosen was on a rise slightly above and west of the clearing, a rocky outcrop partially covered by vegetation that offered a reasonable line of sight to the area, without requiring the group to descend to ground level where the clearing was located. From there, with their flashlights off so as not to compromise their night vision, it was possible to distinguish the general shape of the space below. A darker opening in the general darkness of the forest, demarcated by the trunks of the surrounding trees that minimally reflected the moonlight, that managed to penetrate to that level. For approximately 2 hours, nothing extraordinary happened. The silence they had noticed during the daytime visit was also present at night. Perhaps even denser, or perhaps just more perceptible, without the distraction of the senses that daylight provided. The four remained on the rocky outcrop, observing, making notes, when they thought there was something to record communicating, in hushed voices when necessary. Farish had brought a pocket watch and recorded the time with each observation. A field habit he maintained regardless of the circumstances. It was shortly after midnight that Clara Voss touched Farish's arm without saying anything and pointed towards the clearing. Something was moving down there. Farish focused his gaze on the point Clara had indicated. For a moment he saw nothing but the uniform darkness of the vegetation. Then his eyes adjusted, or perhaps what lay beneath became more visible in a way that didn't depend solely on the available light. And he saw, not clearly, not in a way that allowed for a precise description. But there was a movement in the center of the clearing that couldn't be attributed to the wind, because there was no wind that night, and it lacked the erratic, random quality of an animal's movement. It had a different quality. A quality that Farish struggled for days to find adequate words to describe in his notes, and which he eventually recorded as intentional, and at the same time, inhuman, knowing that this description was simultaneously insufficient and the most honest he could produce. Movement that seemed to know where it was going, but didn't move in the way that anything he had previously encountered moved. As if the rules governing how bodies move in space were at that specific point slightly different from the rules governing the rest of the world. George Pell saw it too. His notes from that night, written in a handwriting that was noticeably less controlled than usual, described the movement as a disturbance in the dark. A shape, he thought, he saw but which disappeared when he tried to focus directly on it, remaining only in the periphery of the visual field where human perception processes things in a way that is less filtered by rational expectation. Robert Ashby said nothing for a long time. He stood absolutely still, his eyes fixed on the clearing below, and then without warning he began to stand. Farish reacted immediately. He placed his hand on Ashby's shoulder with a firmness that was difficult to attribute solely to ordinary protective instinct. There was an urgency in that gesture that everyone present felt. Ashby stopped. He blinked. He looked at Farish with an expression that, according to Farish himself, was the expression of someone who had just been awakened from a dream in the middle of a dream. Not completely present, but returning. As if for a brief moment he had started to go somewhere without having made the conscious decision to go. Ashby was later unable to describe what he had felt at that moment, not satisfactorily. He said there was a feeling not exactly of being called, because being called implies that something external is making an appeal to which you can respond or not. It was more as if the idea of moving towards the clearing had arisen within him in a way that didn't seem different from any other thought of his, with the same texture, the same inner quality, as if the distinction between an impulse that comes from within and an impulse that comes from outside, had for a moment ceased to exist. Farish decided they would leave. There was no drama in the decision. It was made with the same deliberate calm with which he had made all the decisions during the expedition. But there was a purpose to it that no one questioned. They descended the slope in close formation. Farish in front, Clara and Pell in the middle. Ashby last, but with Pell's hand firmly on his shoulder for much of the descent. No one spoke much. There was something that needed to be processed before it could be articulated, and everyone recognized that. Back at the home of the resident who was hosting them, Farish stayed up until dawn, writing, not only recording what he had observed, but trying to construct some kind of comprehensible framework around the experience, some way of placing what had happened within a context that didn't require him to completely abandon everything he knew about how the world works. He couldn't, and he recognized in the last pages written that night that perhaps the inability to construct this framework was in itself a discovery, the confirmation that there was something there that genuinely existed outside the limits of what any framework he could bring from the outside would be able to contain. The next morning, Robert Ashby woke with something different in his eyes, not dramatic, not obviously disturbing. It was subtle. That quality of distance Dessa Mabry had described when he spoke of the people who had entered that place and returned. As if a part of Ashby had remained there on the slope at the point where he had begun to rise. Before Farish held him back, and what had descended the mountain with the group was almost all of him, but not completely. Farish observed this silently during breakfast. Clara saw that he had observed, and the two exchanged a look that needed no words. There was an implicit decision in that look that the expedition had reached a point where continuing would be irresponsible, that there were things that place was willing to show, and things it demanded in return for showing, and that the price it had begun to demand from Robert Ashby was a price that no academic result justified paying. They left Sevier County 2 days later. The drive back to Knoxville was long and silent. Ashby slept most of the way with that deep, motionless sleep that feels less like rest and more like absence. Farish stared out the car window as the mountains faded on the horizon, wondering what they would do with everything they had brought back, what they could say, what they should say, and what perhaps would be wisest to leave in those mountains where it belonged, where the ancient memory filled silence would know how to preserve it better than any written page ever could. The return to Knoxville did not bring the relief that Edmund Farish had, on some level, hoped for. There was an implicit idea, not articulated but present, that the physical distance of the Sevier County mountains would function as a kind of separation, a clear line between what had happened there and the everyday life that awaited on the other side. This idea proved wrong in the first few days back, and in a way that Farish took a while to admit even to himself. The notes he had taken during the expeditions filled 4 entire notebooks written with that compact density characteristic of his field work. margins filled with secondary observations, pages with arrows connecting ideas that had emerged at different times, rudimentary diagrams of topography, and the group's positioning during the various visits to Corvo Summit. It was rich material. It was also material that persistently resisted any attempt to transform it into something that could be presented within the normal parameters of academic work. Farish tried. He spent the first few weeks back organizing the material, constructing chronologies, separating what could be classified as objective observation from what clearly belonged to the category of subjective experience. It was an exercise he had done dozens of times throughout his career with field materials of very different natures. But this time something wasn't working. The two categories, objective and subjective, in a way, slipping into one another in a way that made separation not only difficult, but fundamentally dishonest, because the truth was that what had happened in that place didn't fit into that distinction. The objective and the subjective had merged there in a way that was in itself part of what needed to be described. Robert Ashby was the immediate concern. In the days following his return, his colleagues in the department noticed something different about him, without being able to name exactly what it was. It was that quality of detachment that Dessa Mabry had described, present, functional, capable of conversation and work, but with something withdrawn, as if the point from which he observed the world had shifted slightly backward from where it usually stood. He continued to attend classes, continued to fulfill his academic obligations, continued to be recognizable as Robert Ashby in all practical aspects of daily life. But there was a film between him and the world around him that hadn't been there before the expedition. Ferris spoke with him a few weeks after his return, a long conversation conducted with the same care and patience that Ferris applied to his conversations with rural communities, because he had learned that forcing an opening that the person wasn't ready for was always counterproductive. Ashby listened, responded, and was honest within his capacity for honesty. He said there were times when he felt he had left something behind in the mountains. Not a specific thing, not a memory or an identifiable emotion, but a quality of presence within himself that he perceived as now absent, as if a part of what constituted him as a person had remained at that point on the hillside where he had begun to stand before Ferris held him. He also said he dreamed about the place. Not in a disturbing way. They weren't nightmares. There was nothing threatening in the dreams. It was simpler, and in a way more disconcerting than that. In the dreams he was on Raven's summit, in the clearing, and there was a quality of belonging in that being there that was more complete than any quality of belonging he had felt anywhere in the waking world, as if that was the place where he was supposedly meant to be, and everything else, Knoxville, the university, his career, the people he knew, was a kind of temporary detour from a path that would eventually lead him back. Ferris listened to all of this and felt a weight that was difficult to separate into its component parts. There was guilt. He had been the one who organized the expedition. He had been the one who agreed to the night visit. There was genuine concern for Ashby as a person. And there was also, beneath all of that, a layer of something closer to recognition. Because some of the things Ashby described were not entirely foreign to his own experience since returning. The mountains of County Sevier also occupied a disproportionate space in his own mind. There were also moments when the silence of that place seemed more present than the silence of the surroundings. There was also, at times, a difficult-to-name feeling that something had been left incomplete, that there was a conversation begun on those slopes that had not reached an end. Clara Voss handled the return differently. She immersed herself in the work with an intensity that her colleagues attributed to the natural enthusiasm of a researcher with rich material at hand, but which Ferris recognized as something different, a way of keeping the material at a processable distance, of keeping it within the limits where it could be handled without being manipulated back. She began to compile everything she had collected about the figure the residents called the one who stayed. The fragments of different conversations, the variations in the accounts, the consistencies that emerged when you superimposed enough versions on top of each other. What this compilation revealed was something Ferris found both fascinating and disturbing. There was a consistency at the core of the accounts that went beyond what would be expected in an oral tradition passed down through generations in a community without access to external means of communication. Normally, stories that travel only through human memory from generation to generation accumulate significant variations. The details change, the core shifts, the versions multiply in a way that makes it difficult to identify what, if anything, was there at the beginning. But accounts of the presence on the hillside showed an unusual stability in their central elements. The idea of a place where the world became thinner, the idea that the presence there was not hostile but absolute, the idea that people who entered that space without adequate awareness of what they were entering came out different, or did not come out at all. Clara developed a theory that she presented to Ferris during an afternoon discussion that lasted several hours. It was a theory she herself described as extremely speculative, but one that had emerged from the overlapping of everything she had collected in a way she couldn't ignore. The idea was that what the residents of County Sevier had preserved in their collective memory for so many generations was not a story, nor a legend, nor a belief in the conventional sense. It was a protocol, a form of practical knowledge about how to coexist with something that had been in that place for longer than any human memory could reach, and that would continue to be there for longer than any future anyone could reasonably imagine. The disappearance of Abigail Collins within this theory took on a different dimension. It wasn't a crime. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't even necessarily a tragedy, although the loss of a person is always a loss, regardless of the context. It was the consequence of an encounter with something that didn't operate according to the categories by which human beings generally organize their experiences. an encounter for which Abigail, despite knowing those mountains better than most, had not been prepared in the specific way that encounter demanded. Ferris held on to this theory for a long time. She returned to it repeatedly in the following weeks, testing it against what she had observed, against what she had heard, against what she continued to feel in that inner space where Raven's summit remained present in a way that time did not diminish. And the more she returned, the more she felt that there was something there that was right. Not in a way that she could defend in an academic publication, not in a way that would withstand the conventional scrutiny of the field, but in a way that was honest to what she had experienced, in a way that respected the reality of what she had found instead of reducing it to something that fit more comfortably into available categories. It was during this period that he made a decision that surprised his colleagues and generated discussions in the university's anthropology department for some time afterward. He decided not to publish the expedition's results. Not at that moment, and possibly never. Not out of academic dishonesty. Ferris was incapable of that. But for a reason, he explained in a long, carefully written letter to the head of the department, a reason that boiled down to this. There were things that the act of publishing exposed to the world in a way he wasn't sure he had the right to expose. There was knowledge that the Sevier County community had carefully guarded for generations, precisely because it recognized that this knowledge required a specific context to be handled responsibly. And to take this knowledge out of that context, to turn it into an academic article, submit it to peer review, distribute it to readers unprepared for what they were receiving, would be a form of irresponsibility that his conscience could not authorize. The notebooks were put away. Ashby gradually improved over the following months. The quality of distance that had characterized the weeks immediately following his return diminished, not disappearing completely, but receding to a level that allowed for a functional and, in many respects, fulfilling life. Clara continued her academic work in other directions, but kept the expedition materials organized with a care that suggested she hadn't ruled out the possibility of returning to them at some point in the future. And the mountains of County Sevier remained what they had always been, impassive, dense, holding within themselves that silence with memory that existed long before anyone had felt it, and that would continue to exist long after. Raven's summit remained where it had always been, visible from certain points in the valley on clear days, a dark shape against the sky that the locals identified without needing to look for very long. In the same way, one identifies something that has been part of the landscape for a lifetime. And somewhere on those slopes, in that place where the world narrowed, where the boundary between what is and what was ceased to be a clear line, Abigail Collins had gone with that quiet determination that everyone who knew her remembered towards something that had called to her in a way that didn't use words, and that whatever it was had recognized in her something that justified the call. What he had recognized, no one who stayed behind was ever able to say. The years that followed Edmund Ferris's expedition did not erase County Sevier from the memory of those who had been there. What they did erase, however, was the superficial urgency, that layer of immediate alertness that any intense experience carries in the first days and weeks after it happens. What remained after that layer dissolved was something more solid and quieter. It was the kind of thing that doesn't occupy the foreground of conscious thought, but is always present somewhere deeper, like a stone at the bottom of a river that the current cannot move. Ferris continued his academic career with the same competence and seriousness that had always characterized his work. He published further studies, mentored other researchers, participated in conferences, and contributed to debates within his field in a way that his peers continued to recognize as valuable. Outwardly, he was the same Edmund Ferris. Inwardly, and this he recorded in personal notes not intended for public use, written in a notebook, separate from the fore, containing the formal records of the expedition, there was a clear dividing line between before and after. A line that was neither dramatic nor debilitating, but real, like a small fracture in a bone that heals, but that the body never completely forgets, especially when the climate changes. What time did was something interesting to the story of Abigail Collins, and everything that revolved around her. As the years went by, 1930, 1935, 1940, the community of Sevier County continued to exist with that knowledge in the way it always had, not as an active secret, not as something that needed to be protected with conscious effort, but as part of the fabric of life in that place, present in the ways of speaking, in the choices of where to build and where not to build, in the way the elders responded. When someone from outside asked about certain areas of the forest, with that extra second's pause before answering, with those carefully chosen words that said enough to satisfy the question without opening the door they didn't want to open. Dessa Mabry died in 1938, according to what Ferris learned from a letter from a resident with whom he had maintained sporadic correspondence over the years following the expedition. He died in his own bed on the property where he had spent his entire life with the same proximity to the mountains that had characterized every day of his existence. Ferris read the news and stood still for a long time, feeling the specific weight of the loss of someone who had carried within him a kind of knowledge that would not be easily replaced. With Dessa went a layer of memory that had formed over decades of attentive observation, and a relationship with that landscape that very few people still alive could replicate. Robert Ashby followed a trajectory that his academic colleagues found surprising, although Ferris, when he learned of it, was not surprised. A few years after the Sevier County expedition, Ashby left the university. Not dramatically, there was no break, no pronouncements. He simply gradually reduced his involvement with academic work as someone who realized that where he was no longer where he needed to be. Eventually, he went to live in a rural area of eastern Tennessee, not far from the Appalachian Mountains. close enough that the choice seemed to those who knew the story something that went beyond geographical coincidence. He continued writing, but for himself. He never published anything after the expedition. He never spoke publicly about Crow's Summit, or Abigail Collins, or what he had felt that night when he had begun to rise, and Ferris had held his shoulder. Clara Voss was the only one in the group who eventually returned to Sevier County, not to the clearing, not to Raven Summit, but to the community. She returned in 1932 alone, spending a few weeks talking to residents who still reminded her of her first visit. She wasn't collecting material for publication. There was no explicit academic agenda. When Ferris asked her in a letter what had motivated her return, she took a few weeks to reply, and when she did, she said something he copied into his personal notebook, dated it, and kept. She said, there were things that needed to be checked from time to time, that there was a responsibility in having been there and having heard what she had heard and having seen what she had seen, a responsibility that didn't end with the end of the expedition, that someone needed to keep paying attention even from afar, even without expecting to find new answers, just paying attention. It was the least one could do. Ferris understood perfectly what she meant. World War II arrived and changed the country in ways that reached even the most isolated regions of the Appalachians. Young men from mountain communities left for battlefronts in places their parents could barely locate on a map. Some returned. Others did not. The life that had existed in those regions before the war never fully returned to what it had been, not because the war had destroyed anything specific, but because it had to accelerate changes that were already underway, transforming the relationship between isolated communities and the rest of the country in a way that was irreversible. Over the following decades, Sevier County changed. The roads improved. Electricity reached properties that had previously lived entirely by lamplight. Radio entered homes, and then other forms of communication connected those communities to the flow of information that the rest of the country breathed. The generations that had grown up with the kind of embodied knowledge that Dessa Mabry carried grew old and died. And what they passed on was inevitably filtered by the new realities of a world that had changed more in 30 years than it had in the previous 3 centuries. But Raven Summit hadn't changed. The improved roads, electricity, and radio hadn't reached that particular part of the hillside, not because anyone had tried to bring it, but because there was a collective unspoken way of avoiding that area that was stronger than any developmental impulse. The younger residents, those who had grown up amidst the post-war transformations, perhaps couldn't articulate with the same clarity that Dessa Mabry had articulated why certain areas of the forest were left alone. But they knew in the same vague, tangible way one knows when it's time to stop down a path, not out of specific fear, but out of a wisdom that comes from a place deeper than conscious reason can reach. It was in the early 60s that Edmund Ferris's notebooks gained unexpected new relevance. Ferris had died in 1957, aged 71, leaving his papers to the university library with the specific instruction that the 4 notebooks from the expedition to County Sevier should not be made available for public consultation for at least 25 years after his death. It was an unusual instruction, and the librarian responsible for the collection at the time had made notes about it that expressed a restrained but visible perplexity. But the instruction was respected. In 1962, 5 years after Ferris's death, a young researcher named Daniel Pruitt arrived at the university library in Knoxville, interested in the field collections of anthropologists from the first half of the century. It was a broad survey. He wasn't looking for anything specific, just mapping what existed. When he came across Ferris's papers and found the instruction about the 4 notebooks, the restriction had expired years ago. The librarian handed them over unceremoniously. Pruitt took them to a table in the corner of the reading room and began leafing through the first one. It took him 3 hours to read all 4 notebooks, stopping only when he needed to turn the page. When he finished, he sat in silence for a while, a time that the librarian, who had noticed the intensity with which the young researcher was reading, later described as having lasted longer than seemed comfortable. Then Pruitt closed the last notebook, put all 4 in order, and returned them to the counter. He thanked them. He left. He returned 2 days later. He asked for the notebooks again and read them a second time, this time making his own notes with much more care. And when he returned the notebooks for the second time, he asked the librarian if there was any additional material belonging to Ferris that wasn't catalogued in the main inventory. The librarian consulted the records and mentioned a separate notebook, smaller with a different cover, that had arrived with the other papers but was catalogued as a personal diary rather than research material. Pruitt asked to see. What was in that smaller notebook was what Ferris had kept outside of formal records, thoughts that weren't field observations, connections he'd made in the months and years after the expedition, questions he hadn't answered and had learned to carry without expecting answers. And there was also on the last pages something Pruitt stared at for a long time. It was a list written in Ferris's careful handwriting in ink that had faded to a light brown over the decades. A list of names, 12 in total, with dates next to each. The names Ferris had managed to collect throughout his research of people who had disappeared in that specific area of Sevier County over approximately 80 years. 12 names, 12 dates, and next to each a short note, sometimes just a word, sometimes a phrase, about what had been found or not found. Abigail Collins was on the list, dated April 23rd, 1924. And next to her name, Ferris had written only 3 words in handwriting that seemed more deliberate than the other entries, as if he had thought about it longer before writing. It was on his own initiative. Pruitt copied the entire list into his notebook. He returned the personal diary. He left the library and went straight to the nearest post office, where he mailed a letter to an address in East Tennessee, Robert Ashby's address, which he had obtained through the anthropology department. The letter asked if Ashby would be willing to discuss the 1927 expedition to Sevier County. The reply arrived 3 weeks later. It was short. It simply stated that Ashby would receive Pruitt if he came in person, but on one condition: that the conversation not be recorded, not be transcribed, and not be quoted in any publication. That what was said would remain between the two of them, that there were things that could be passed from person to person in direct conversation, but that lost something essential or gained something dangerous when they were put on paper for any unknown eye to read. Pruitt accepted the conditions. He went to East Tennessee. He spent an entire afternoon with Robert Ashby, then over 60, a man who had found in Appalachia the life that university had failed to give him. There is no record of what was said that afternoon. Ashby's conditions were respected. What Pruitt brought back with him was invisible, carried in the same way that certain things have always been carried in those mountains, not on paper, not in fixed words, but somewhere inside where the things that truly matter are kept, passed from one person to another, when the time is right and trust is sufficient. And the mountains remained where they had always been. Daniel Pruitt returned from his visit to Robert Ashby different from how he had left, not in the disturbing and visible way that had characterized Ashby's return from the 1927 expedition. There was not in that return the quality of distance that Dessa Mabry had described. There was not the film between the person and the world that Ashby's colleagues had noticed at the time. It was something more subtle, a different quality of attention, as if the filters through which Pruitt processed the world around him had been somehow recalibrated during that afternoon in East Tennessee. Not removed, but adjusted to a slightly different frequency than he had operated at before. His colleagues at the university noticed that he had become quieter, not taciturn, not distant, just more selective with his words, more deliberate in his choices of what was worth saying aloud and what was worth keeping in the inner silence where certain things work better. It was the kind of change that someone who didn't know him well could easily attribute to the natural maturation of a young researcher who had come into contact with material dense enough to force an internal reorganization. And perhaps that was exactly it. But Pruitt knew it was also something more than that. And he had learned from Ashby in the few hours they had spent together with us not to force a distinction where the distinction resisted being made. He continued the surveying work that had led him to the Knoxville Library. But with Sevier County now operating as a sort of silent gravitational center, around which everything else orbited, it wasn't an obsession. Pruitt was too disciplined a man to allow anything to become an obsession. It was more like a guide, like the way a compass points north, not because it's obsessed with north, but because it's simply the direction its nature inclines it. Over the following years, Pruitt quietly built a broader understanding of what had happened in that place over time. Not through a formal expedition, not through declared field research, but through a network of patient conversations with people who held pieces of the story. Descendants of Sevier County families who had spread to other parts of Tennessee and North Carolina over the decades. Researchers from other fields whose work had touched upon that region without delving deeper. Older people who held memories of memories. Those second and third-hand accounts that lose details but preserve the core with surprising tenacity. What this network of conversations revealed, piece by piece over the years, was a story that stretched much further back than anything Ferris had managed to document. The 12 names on the list in Ferris's notebook represented only what had been possible to trace within a community memory that became progressively more fragmented the further back in time one went. But there were indications in the oldest ways of talking about that place in the cross-references between accounts from different families who had not had contact with each other for decades, that the pattern extended for much longer than 80 years. How long no one could say precisely, but for a very long time. For a time that began to suggest that what existed in that place on the slopes of County Sevier was not a recent phenomenon, not something that had begun with any identifiable human event. It predated all of that. It was in the language Dessa Mabry had used in his conversation with Clara Voss decades earlier, older than any human memory that region held. It was during this period of silent research that Pruitt found something that Ferris, with all his resources and all his analytical ability, had not found, or perhaps had found, and chosen not to record. It was a reference in an oral account that had reached Pruitt through a descendant of a family from County Sevier, who was then living in Knoxville, to a specific aspect of what happened to people who returned from that area differently. Not all the people who had entered that part of the forest and returned with that quality of distance in their eyes. Only some. Those who had gone deeper, stayed longer, come closer to the center of the clearing than was wise to go. According to the account, these people had developed over the months and years following the contact an ability they did not possess before. Not something dramatic, not something that immediately drew attention. It was an ability to perceive things that other people did not perceive. Not in the supernatural sense that this description might evoke, but in a much more mundane and therefore somewhat more disturbing way. They perceived patterns where other people saw only noise. They sensed when something was about to change before any visible evidence of that change was available. They had a relationship with silence that was different from the relationship most people have. Not a discomfort with it, not a need to fill it, but a kind of fluency. As if silence were a language they had learned during that contact, and which they continued to speak internally long after they had left the forest. Pruitt lingered with that account for a long time. He thought of Robert Ashby, who had chosen to live near the mountains, and had spent decades writing for himself, things he didn't intend for any reader. He thought of Clara Voss, who had returned to County Sevier years after the expedition, not with an academic, but with that sense of responsibility. She had described in her letter to Ferris the responsibility of continuing to pay attention. He thought of the quality of his own attention after the afternoon with Ashby, of that subtle recalibration he had perceived in himself. And he thought of Abigail Collins, who had gone with that quiet determination that all who knew her remembered toward something that had called to her in a way that didn't use words. There was a line connecting all these points, not a straight line, more like the lines that water traces when it finds its way through stones, following the logic of least resistance, which is also always the logic of the greatest available truth. A line that suggested that what lay on that hillside in County Sevier was not simply a danger to be avoided or a mystery to be solved. It was something that interacted with people in different ways depending on how the person approached it. With what level of awareness, with what quality of attention, with what willingness to receive rather than merely observe. The people who disappeared were those who arrived without this awareness, those who entered that space as they would any other, with the usual filters of everyday thought, intact without any preparation for what that place demanded of those who entered it. Those who returned changed were those who had come close enough for something of the place to touch them, but not so close that the contact was complete. And there was perhaps a third category, that of the people who arrived with the right awareness, with the kind of openness and attention that the place seemed to recognize. What happened to these people, if they existed, was something about which Pruitt had found no direct account, except perhaps for Abigail Collins, who had gone on her own with determination, like someone who had made a decision. The last person Pruitt spoke to about Sevier County, before ending his informal research, was a woman named Ruth Barrow, granddaughter of Eunice Barrow, the 75-year-old woman who had spoken with Clara Voss during the 1927 expedition. Ruth was then in her early 40s, had grown up in Sevier County, and had moved to Knoxville as an adult for work, but returned to the area several times a year, maintaining that connection to her place of origin that people raised in such communities rarely managed to completely sever. Pruitt and Ruth met at a cafe in Knoxville on an autumn afternoon in 1968. The conversation lasted a little over 2 hours. Ruth had agreed to talk because she had been informed through the network of connections Pruitt had built over the years that he was someone who had approached the subject the right way, not with the eagerness of someone wanting to extract secrets, but with the kind of patient respect that such knowledge demanded of anyone who wanted to get close to him. She told Pruitt that the Sevier County community had changed a lot over the past few decades, but that there was one thing that hadn't changed, that the people who grew up in that area still learned in ways they sometimes couldn't clearly articulate themselves to recognize that hillside area as a place that demanded a specific kind of respect. Not fear, not superstition, respect. The same way you respect anything that is much bigger and much older than you. Not because it's threatening, but because disregarding something like that reveals more about the limitations of the one who disregards it than about the nature of what is being disregarded. He also said, that there was a story circulating among the older families in the region, not told openly, not in the way ordinary stories are told, but passed down at the right times to the right people about what had happened to Abigail Collins. Not the disappearance itself, what had happened afterward, that there were people who claimed to have seen Abigail over the years following her disappearance, on the edge of that area of the forest. Not clearly, not in a way that allowed confirmation, but glimpses, presences in the periphery of vision that disappeared when the eye tried to focus directly. A quality in the air near that area that some people described at certain times as familiar in a way they couldn't rationally explain. Pruitt listened to all of this without interrupting. When Ruth finished, they were silent for a moment. A comfortable silence. The kind that happens between people who have reached a point together where words are no longer the most suitable instrument. Then Pruitt thanked her. Ruth nodded, and before getting up to leave, she said one last thing that Pruitt recorded that night from memory. On the last pages of the notebook he had used for this phase of the research, Ruth said that her grandmother, Eunice, had taught her when she was young that there were places in the world where the distinction between being inside and being outside, between being here and being there, between being now and being in another time, was less absolute than in other places, and that in those places, some people found what they were looking for without ever having known they were looking for it. That perhaps that was what had happened to Abigail Collins. That perhaps the disappearance that the whole community had experienced as a loss was, from Abigail's point of view, something entirely different. An arrival to a place that had always been there, waiting with that specific patience of very ancient things for the right moment and the right person. Pruitt closed the notebook. He looked out the cafe window at the Knoxville autumn street with its falling leaves, and that particular color that October late afternoons have in that part of Tennessee. And he thought that he had reached the end of everything that could be found about this story through the paths he had traveled. That the rest, what lay beyond the point where Abigail Collins' tracks had stopped on the slope of Crow's Ridge, what lay beyond what Ashby had begun to feel that night and hadn't finished feeling, what lay beyond everything anyone had managed to put into words about that place, existed in a space where words simply couldn't reach. And perhaps that's exactly how it should be. Sevier County still exists today. The Appalachian Mountains of Tennessee remain with that permanence that only truly ancient things possess, indifferent to the passage of time, indifferent to the transformations that occur in the valleys below, indifferent to the generations that come and go, and arrive again with new names and new stories, but with the same fundamental fragility of anything that lives only once. The roads that crisscross the region today are paved, wide, and well signposted. Tourists who arrive in the vicinity of Great Smoky Mountains National Park often don't imagine that they are passing through a landscape that carries within it layers of events that no tourist map records and no travel guide mentions. Crow Summit has no sign. There's no official trail leading to it. It doesn't appear on any hiking itineraries. For those who didn't grow up in that region, it's just another elevation among the dozens that make up that part of the Appalachians. Just another peak with another dark shape against the sky when the sun is low. But for those who grew up there, for those who inherited the knowledge passed down through generations by those families who still maintain deep roots in that land, Crow Summit is a different kind of landmark. One that appears in conversations with that specific pause before and after the name. One that makes children understand, without anyone needing to explain directly, that there are places that are respected differently from other places. The clearing is still there. No one has gone to check it recently, at least no one who has returned, willing to talk about what they found. The area of darker soil in the center, which Edmund Ferris had described in his notes with terminology that he himself had recognized as scientifically inadequate but honest, remains part of that place, in the same way that the rocks and the outward-leaning trees remain as something that simply is, without needing any external validation to continue being. Ferris's notebooks are in the university library, in Knoxville cataloged, preserved, accessible to anyone who knows where to look. His personal diary, too. The list with 12 names and 12 dates as well. Abigail Collins, April 23, 1924, was on her own account. Those words are there in the faded ink of a man who spent his whole life learning to listen to what communities keep inside, and who finally recognized that there were things that could only be said in a very simple way, or could not be said at all. Robert Ashby lived until 1973. He died in eastern Tennessee, not far from the mountains he had chosen as his neighborhood for the rest of his life. The notebooks he had filled over decades of solitary writing were found in his home after his death. Dozens of them, carefully numbered and organized, but with no indication that anyone intended them to be read by anyone other than himself. What was inside, no one who had access to it spoke publicly about. Perhaps no one had access. Perhaps someone did, and honored the same kind of silence that Ashby had honored his entire life. Clara Voss outlived Ashby by almost a decade, dying in 1982 at over 80 years old, having built a solid and respected career, studying the oral traditions of rural communities in the southern United States. None of her published works directly reference the 1927 expedition to Sevier County. However, researchers who have carefully studied her work have identified, scattered throughout decades of publications, fragments of ideas that seem to be rooted in what she had heard and seen in those mountains. Like seeds planted in different soil that grow in slightly altered forms, but retain at their core the same essence of their origin. Daniel Pruitt never published anything about Sevier County. He kept the promise he had made to Ashby, not because he was legally obligated, but because he had understood during that afternoon in eastern Tennessee that there were forms of knowledge that academic publication was not the proper vehicle for transmitting. He continued his career in other directions, lived a long life, and according to those who knew him well, always possessed that slightly different quality of attention that he had developed after his contact with history, that fluency with silence, that ability to perceive patterns where other people saw only noise. And Abigail Collins remains where she remains, which is somewhere that has no address in the conventional sense of the word, which is somewhere on that slope of County Sevier where the world became thinner, and she crossed to the side with the quiet determination that all who knew her remembered as one of the most fundamental things about her, which is in the memories of the families that still grow up in that region, and who learn from an early age to recognize Raven's summit by the specific care with which the elders pronounce the name, which is in the pages of Farris's notebooks, in the faded ink of an honest man who came as close as he did and recognized the boundary of what was possible to say, which is, in a way, the story we've just been through together. There is something that remains after all this, not an answer. The answers that this type of story promises are always the kind of promise that isn't fulfilled in the way we expect. And perhaps that's the point. What remains is a question, not about what was in that clearing, not about what happened to Abigail Collins on April 23, 1924, but a broader and at the same time more intimate question than any of those. The question of what we do with places and stories that resist being fully understood. Whether resistance to understanding is a flaw, something that sufficient time and effort will eventually resolve, or whether it is, in some cases, the very nature of what is being encountered. Information in itself, a way for the place or the story to say that it exists in a dimension that needs an instrument other than rational understanding to be touched. The Appalachian Mountains of Tennessee don't answer that question. They've never answered any question in that way. They've never been the kind of landscape that offers clarity or easy comfort. They're the kind of landscape that throws the question back at the one who asked it with that dense, ancient silence that holds memory and that waits with that specific patience of things that exist on a time scale that human life can't truly grasp to see what the person will do with the question, now that they're alone with it. We journeyed through this history together, valley by valley, slope by slope, from 1924 to the years that followed, through the memories of people who carried this knowledge with care and responsibility, and we arrived at the same point where everyone who approached this history arrived before us. At the point where the tracks stop, where the ground becomes darker for reasons that no analysis fully grasps, where the silence has a quality unlike any silence we have known elsewhere. What you do now with what you've heard is your part of the story, and perhaps it's the most important part of all. If this video captivated you until the end, and you want to support the channel so that stories like this can continue to exist, the link to my ebook is in the description and in the pinned comment. Your support is what keeps all of this alive. And if this journey stayed with you in some way, if the name Abigail Collins, or the silence of Crow Summit, or the specific quality of those Tennessee mountains occupied a space in your mind that you didn't expect, leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from. These stories grow when shared among people who know how to listen. And those who made it to the end of this video clearly know how to listen. Subscribe to the channel, activate the bell, and stay with us. There's much more waiting for you.